This is Tommy's Outdoors 43. And you look at the title of that podcast and you're probably wondering what the heck is going on. So I guess a disclaimer is in order. So it's not my intention to convince you or advocate to support one or another political option. My intention, however, is to get you informed what various political options stand for with relation to issues that are important for you, dear listener. Outdoors person, regardless whether you're hunter or angler or hiker or cyclist or runner, there are certain things that are important and they can only be supported or changed through policy. Let me give you an example. Cyclists care about greenways and bike paths and infrastructure to support cycling. Mountain bikers and hikers care about land access issues and trail access. Hunters and anglers and animal lovers, for that matter, care about wildlife and protection of species. There are also more general issues related to outdoors, like loss of biodiversity and changing climate and so on and so forth. So it is my sincere intention and hope that this is only the first podcast of this series where I get to talk to politicians representing various political options. And hopefully, through those discussions, you, dear listener, can be better informed and make better decisions how to place your support to protect the future and improve the future of your sport and your activity. So that's really it. It just happened that the first politician that accepted invitation to my podcast is Toiréasa Ferris from Sinn Féin party. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. Toiréasa Ferris, thank you very much for your time, taking your time out of your busy schedule to be with us here and talk to us.
Thank you for having me, Tommy. Thank you.
That's great. So I was preparing for that podcast and trying to give like a proper and good introduction.
Okay.
But there's so many things that maybe you're going to do much better job at introducing yourself to our listeners than I would.
Okay, I'll try anyway. I suppose first off, I'm a mother of 2 children and I'm also a full-time elected representative for Sinn Féin. I'm married to Patrick. We've been together for, I hope I get this right, 17 years now. And I'm one of 6 children to Martin and Marie Ferris. We grew up in Arfert. Your listeners who are familiar with my father would know that he spent 10 years of my childhood in prison. And we were effectively raised by a single mother household. But I had an excellent big brother, Eamon, who took on the role of father figure for those 10 years. And it didn't seem to affect us too badly because we've all come out the other end, I suppose, stronger and better people for it.
You see, I would never say that.
Would you not?
No, because I didn't know that. So.
No. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. No, I think listeners, when I'm listening to a radio station, I like to know about the personal side of the person. So I could have gone on that I lecture in law and I'm Kerry County Council for 16 years, but that's kind of boring to most people. That gives a
personal touch. I agree. I agree.
So that's a bit about me. Unless there's anything else you'd like me to tell your listeners.
Oh yeah, you're elected representative for 15 years, right?
It'll be 16 in September.
Years,
yeah.
Right, and you're also in a county Kerry council. You're a
council. County Kerry, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what happened was it was actually my father's timing was impeccable. The night before my penultimate exam of my degree, I had Spanish the next morning and company law the morning after before I would finish my degree. And my father chose that time and that moment to ring me and to tell me that the party here in Kerry were considering selecting me to be co-opted into Kerry County Council because he had recently been elected to the National Parliament. and you couldn't have a dual mandate. And he was a sitting councillor. So I spent, instead of studying, my Spanish and my company law, I spent the next 2 nights going, how the heck am I going to tell him no? Because I've never said no to my father, nor did I eventually in that case. So in September 2003, I was supposed to sit the entrance exams for King's Inn because it was my dream since I was 11 to become a barrister. And the party convinced me to defer that for 1 year, they told me, to go into the council, contest the elections the following June, which would have been 2004. And then after that, I could go back and get on with my life and co-opt somebody else into the seat. And 16 years later, I'm still there. So maybe the electorate might decide 16 years is enough and I might get my boot out the door on the 24th of May, but we'll see.
I don't think.
Oh, I don't know. Never know with elections.
Listen, Toiréasa, so like we had a quick chat before this recording, and really I would like to talk to you about various things that might affect outdoorsmen and women, and they can take that into account where they're voting. But perhaps, are there any major initiatives or major wins in the past that people might generally not be aware of that could that impacted their that
we've decided or developed at Kerry County Council level, is it?
Yeah, so any thing that you think would impact people who are enjoying the outdoors, being cyclists or hikers or anglers or whoever else, that they may not know that, these great things happen already. And
yeah, well, I suppose the thing I'm most excited about at the moment is we are almost at a point where the Tralee Fenit Walkway is going to be developed. And aside from, the huge positivity that'll bring to the area and the opportunity it will give to all of us to enjoy, the outdoor experience a bit more, we're going to be unique here in Kerry because John Edwards, I spoke with him about 2-3 years ago, and we brought him in for a deputation to the council, and he had what I think is an absolute genius idea, and I have been very vocal in pushing it ever since, and that is, in addition to the Greenway connecting Tralee with Fenit, we would develop a loop where you have a Blue Way. So going from the canal out to Fenit, either by kayak or swimming or some other method on the water, and then coming back in by bike or walking or running, whatever you choose. And eventually it is hoped that Blue Way could be developed to go beyond Fenit and maybe as far as Kerry Head. Wow. So I think that is a huge opportunity for this region because, to my knowledge, once we develop both, we will be the first area in the country that has a Greenway and a Blue Way that are connected.
Oh, wow. I didn't know. I read about the Blue Way, but I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. So what's the idea? How is it going to look like?
Well, it's open to so many different ideas. The beauty of it is it requires very little infrastructural investment. So there isn't a huge cost associated with it like you would have with the Greenway, which is why we're somewhat delayed with the Greenway. We're waiting for an announcement of funding. Now, in Kerry County Council, 6 of the 9 municipal district councillors that are there currently have committed €10,000 each this year. So there's a pot of 60,000 there. I gave an extra 1,000 then to make it 11,000 towards signage at the start of the walkway. So once the national money comes, I think it's going to be about, all in all, about €1 million will be spent on delivering the Greenway between Tralee and Fenit, but it will be money well spent.
Yes.
The Blue Way, on the other hand, all we really need is some people like John Edwards and others who have ideas about water activities and sports that could be operational between the canal, which is literally in the town centre, and Fenit Harbour, for them to just come on board and to apply for licences to deliver those services. And the only cost for the taxpayer will be the local authority erecting signage and promoting the fact that this Blue Way exists. Wow. Yeah.
So, and do you think there's going to be any buoys on the water or something just to make it?
You'd have that. Now, we already have the rowing club operational out of the canal, and there had been an issue for years there where people being unable to swim because the lock gates weren't operational. But last year, myself and a couple of other councillors allocated substantial money from our councillors' allocations fund to get those gates operational again, so that the tidal water will clean it from all pollutants. Yes. So it's now suitable for developing swimming competitions and things out of there.
That's fantastic, because on the podcast we spoke many times, I guess, about the Tralee Féin Greenway and also about the Greenway that is in Watford, and how big was that opening that Greenway for the local community and the businesses and so on, and that's why we kind of, and I know many listeners of that podcast are quite eager to, we can't wait until that. What was the biggest obstacle in creating?
Initially, going back to the time that the community first applied for funding, I think the big issue was that there hadn't been adequate community consultation. So there was a lot of local opposition to it.
Yes.
And once the county council got involved and individual staff members spoke to a number of people who had, in fairness to them, genuine grounds for objecting. And once the local authority was able to remedy some of the issues that a Greenway would have presented, then they withdrew their opposition to it. Now, you were never going to satisfy everybody. And I know, and I do feel for the people, particularly one house in particular. Literally, you come out their back door and you're on top of the Greenway. So there's a whole privacy issue with that. And to our understanding, when we were deciding on this matter in the chamber, most, if not all, of the individuals who had concerns had been met with council representatives and had proposals that they agreed with that could remedy the issues. So it took a number of years for that. And bear in mind, we were also in the middle of a recession. There wasn't any likelihood of substantial funding coming anytime soon. So then we got to the point where we're now actually shovel ready. It's gone through the planning process. There is, as I said, 60,000 there that the councillors have allocated to start the works or to use as match funding when the national funding comes. So the only hold up at the moment is a government announcement of funding. But I would be very hopeful. And I'm not just saying this because there's an election next week. I've been saying this since February. I'm very hopeful that there will be funding announced in the coming months.
Well, hopefully this is going to be a big deal. And when do you think it's going to be completed, provided the funding will be announced?
If funding comes this year, I would imagine that it will be completed within a number of months.
Wow.
I would imagine so, yeah.
Oh, that's great to hear. And are there any plans for any other greenways in Kerry area? I know there's a lot of talk about the greenway in
North Kerry Listowel.
North Kerry Listowel, and then around the Ring of Kerry.
South Kerry Greenway, The South Kerry Greenway, and maybe when I am a representative for the Tralee Municipal District, I shouldn't be saying this because we will want to promote the Tralee Féin one as best we can, but when, and I say when because I'm absolutely confident, when the South Kerry Greenway is developed, it will be, I believe, a greenway that will compete with any other internationally. I can just imagine how beautiful it is going to be for walkers and cyclists when you're travelling over that viaduct before you come into Carsiveen, looking out at the ocean, looking at the scenery for miles around. It will be absolutely stunning. Again, I appreciate that there are people that have concerns, some of them about the way in which they claim the council have approached this matter with them. Some are saying they're supportive of the Greenway, but they're opposed to the council using a compulsory purchase order. My understanding is that if only one person objects and refuses to sell their portion of land back to the council, then they have to CPO the entire thing. Now, I'm open to correction on that. Mean? What it means is, you have a number of landowners who are happy and are working with Kerry County Council, but there are some that aren't. And they're going to be going after, my understanding is, an order from the state that gives them permission to compulsorily take that land. Now, they'll be paying for it.
Oh, that's what CPO means.
A CPO, compulsory purchase order. And there are a lot of people that are, objecting to the use of that mechanism, but I don't see any other way for them to achieve this, given that the feedback we've gotten is whatever about a number of other landowners along the line, there are a small amount that the council staff that have been dealing with them believe no matter what they do, they're not going to agree to the project. So I just think it's essential for that part of the county in particular. It is being decimated. We see on the streets of Carsiveen, shops and retail places that have been open for generations and they're shut and they're derelict, and it needs an injection of something for employment, and for the local people to have an amenity as well that they can be proud of.
Yeah, and I think also one of the issues that I have some people raising with me is that massive traffic that is around the ring of Kerry, especially of coaches with tourists and the rental cars and all that, and probably that would be some alternative. Obviously, that wouldn't alleviate completely issue with traffic and the road, infrastructure not suitable for that, but at least some of those tourists will jump on the bike and cycle or that route.
Yeah, I mean, Kerry has attracted walking and cycling tourists for decades, even during periods where we didn't even have cycle lanes and our roads were very dangerous to travel. So can you imagine how many more we will attract when we have safe, accessible routes available to them?
Absolutely.
I think, it's just going to be the injection that we need in every part of this county to have these type of facilities available, not just for ourselves to use, but also visiting tourists.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of cycling, some of my old and trusty cycling listeners would kill me if I not ask you that question. What's your view on the issue of cycling paths, cycling lanes, and cars that are so, some of those are like, these are essentially parking space, not the cycling lane, because there's always cars parked there. And do you think there's any way of addressing that problem?
Look, it's an interesting question, because my position has evolved on this as I've learned more about it. I would have been very vocal and very supportive of developing designated cycle lanes, but more and more across Europe, they're actually making those lanes redundant, and it's about creating an environment, particularly in your town centres, where it's a shared space, where vehicles are travelling at a space that make it safe for cyclists, and rather than having your motorists getting cross with your cyclists and vice versa, where you create a culture where this is a shared space for pedestrians, cyclists and motorists. In relation to the roads outside of the towns, what absolutely drives me mad, there is no point in Kerry County Council drawing a white line and putting in emblems of cyclists and saying this is a designated cycle lane when it is full of potholes, and then you have manholes where the tar has sunk around it, and you're literally more at risk cycling in that lane than you are if you veer out onto the motorway.
I can't agree more.
Yeah. So if we're going to develop cycleways, they have to be fit for purpose and they have to be maintained. And even something as simple as the ones where the surface might be okay, when you don't have a regular cleaning program and there might be chips or pebbles that haven't been swept up, leaves that are making it a hazard. That has to be addressed. But also, the other bugbear I have as someone who lives in a very rural area with very narrow roads on the way is when you have cyclists on those kind of roads cycling two abreast when there's a vehicle coming from one direction or the other. So there has to be a bit of accommodation on both sides.
I was surprised that I actually looked it up in the regulation of road that Ireland allows in the regulation of road to cycle two abreast.
Yes.
Like, I come from Poland. That's, you're just cycling in, single file.
It's fine when there aren't any vehicles coming from either side that you might be impeding. And look, when you are out cycling, it is a social event as such as well. And it's time. I know for my own husband, he was a cycling enthusiast before he had his back operation. It was a chance for him to have a few hours himself and his friends catch up on stuff that they may have missed during the week and that. And I have no issue with them cycling two abreast. But the road safety rules also say you have to drive or cycle with care. And that also means in areas, so for instance, you have a speed limit of 80 kilometres an hour. But if the driving conditions are such that driving at 80 kilometres an hour would be treacherous or dangerous, the rules of the road say you shouldn't. So while it allows you to cycle two abreast, only where it is safe to do so.
Common sense.
Yeah.
And I guess, like you said, it's kind of developing this culture of sharing space. And it's like, I'm just wondering, just of that subject that we just discussed, where to pivot, because there are two things that I want to talk to you next. And one is land access, and I know that you've been involved in about land access. So before we're gonna go to climate change, because that's the next thing, I think it gives us a nice segue, because we talked about issues with the Greenway and the land access and maybe purchasing back. Now, one of the things that I'm saying on the when we're talking about the subject of conservation and wildlife and so on is like, okay, the basis of that is a land management policy. It's like, how are we managing land? How's it, how is access to land managed, and whether people can access land or can access land, and so on and so forth. And I know that you've been involved in the discussions around the land access and public access, public right of way, I suppose, to it. Can you lay it out for our listeners?
Yeah, my position on it, and it may not be popular depending on who your listener is, but I suppose, just to put it in context, there is an absolute obsession almost amongst Irish people when it comes to ownership, and that goes back to our history and our very painful history. So I understand that, and there's a reason why our constitution, when it was being drafted in 1937, decided to give almost absolute rights to property owners, because people had literally fought and died for the right to own a piece of land. So I understand why there is a reluctance, or why there is a practice of reluctance to, give any right over land that, has been in family for a number of generations. That said, anywhere where there is an existing right of way, and I have butted heads on a number of occasions with council management, because I don't think Kerry County Council is doing its job in effectively protecting the rights of way that exist. For example, when you look at Feenet Island, when you look at access to some of the most beautiful beaches that we have in this county, there has been a hesitancy to enforce the legal rights of the public to access those places through the long established paths that have been in place for, time immemorial. But I do also support the right to, or not the right, I support calls to develop more walkways and I don't want to say rights of way, but more access to parts of this country, but only where there is consultation with and respect for the landowners. And most landowners I know, and we're talking primarily about, people who are involved in agriculture and farming, you have to be respectful of the business that they are running.
Yes.
And the fact that a lot of them are very concerned about their exposure to liability under the Occupiers Liability Act, if somebody is to injure themselves when they're traversing their lands. So I believe, and it comes back to what we were saying about the cyclists and the motorists, I do think that there is space for accommodation of, the public's desires to access parts of land, and also to the landowner's right to protect himself and his livelihood. And I do think that with a little bit of a sensible approach and a community spirit, that we can achieve this. So, like, for instance, in Arfort, I was involved with the Arfort Development Association, and a couple of years ago we set up a number of different subcommittees, and one of them was a subcommittee to establish walkways in our village and the surrounding areas, because we're a very, very historical village. And the biggest obstacle we faced was trying to get access and to get agreement to traverse certain areas so that you could create loops where people could go and take in some historical sites or just an amenity walkway. And so many years later, we're not any further along.
So tell me, because this is very interesting to me. So what the law says about the liability? Because it seems to me like I had a discussion on the podcast on a number of occasions. I was talking with his name was Brian Fennell, my buddy Brian Fennell, who is a recreational officer in County Wicklow, and he's working with farmers to actually exactly designate the parts of their land as a walkways or a pathway, so people can enjoy the outdoors. Essentially, I also spoke about access for mountain biking, for example, right? So what the law says at the moment, that if you're on the land that is owned by somebody else, like farmer's land, and you fall off your mountain bike, the farmer is liable for that? Is that what the law says?
You see, there's 3 different categories of people that would be entering your, it's not even have to be your property, you don't have to own it, it's just kind of property that you occupy. So it depends on what category the visitors fall into, the level of the standard of care that's owed to them by the landowner. And I would imagine if there's a designated or an established trail, whether it's for biking or for walking or whatever, or even if it's for members of hunting clubs, the responsibility would be to make sure it's at a standard that could not cause them injury. So if it's somebody who is, that we would understand in layman's terms, somebody who's trespassing, who's there with the intent to do something that they shouldn't be, and without your permission, the law says you have to take, or you can't do anything to deliberately cause that person harm. So you're not going to leave out bear traps for them. And then when their leg is amputated as a result, try and say, oh, well, they were trespassers. The law will impose a financial liability on you as well as a criminal, I would imagine. But say for you or I, if we were deciding that we're going to go along a walkway, and let's say fencing had broken down or had been breached and there was a sharp element there and I cut myself or you cut yourself on it, there could be a potential liability to the landowner for not ensuring...
For negligence.
Well, it's under negligence that they would be taking the cases, but it would be, basically there would be an increased responsibility on the landowner to make sure the lands are maintained in such a way that it would not cause harm to somebody using it.
Does it make it even more difficult if you're building like a mountain bike trails and you have like a 6-foot drop offs and stuff like that? Well, that you can't break your neck, so that probably falls in different category.
When
altogether.
It comes to negligence, I mean, the first question the court is going to look at if somebody is going to sue a landowner is, did they owe this person a duty of care? And in those kind of examples you've given, there's no doubt that they will. The next thing they look at is, well, what standard of care was owed? And what they would look at is the likelihood of injury, the risk of injury occurring, the potential seriousness of the injuries. So if you're talking about drops like that, and
but I mean
coming up on bikes,
like obstacles that are there put on purpose, right? To do jumps and stuff like that.
Yeah, but you're talking about naturally occurring risks that are there, like a cliff is a feature that's naturally there, and how are you going to prevent?
But you know what you're doing, right? You're riding your bike against that to jump, and then something goes wrong and you fall.
But you see, you and I, are very logical and fair-minded people, and that's what you would presume. But I mean, you need only look at some of the civil actions that have been taken. I mean, against the Aquadome here in Tralee, and against other leisure facilities, where you would imagine common sense would mean the judge would say, well, look, if you're going to run on slippy tiles, there is a chance that you're going to slip and hurt yourself. Yeah. But awards have been made. So that's why there is that level of fear among some landowners, because it does not seem that sense is prevailing when it comes to negligence cases and awards being given.
Is there any effort to change the law in that matter?
There are talks about it. There are, and it's not so much about changing the law. It's about seeing if there is scope to introduce guidelines around the compensation and that is awarded and the rules that will govern that. Now, you have the Personal Injuries Board has been kind of a step towards that, but quite a number of businesses are telling us that it's becoming more and more impossible for them to continue to trade, solvently with the massive insurance premiums they're facing because of some personal injuries cases that have been taken against them. But then when you talk to those in the legal profession, they would argue that, the same because always what is being said is when you look at the rate of awards that are given in England for same injuries that are given much higher awards here in Ireland, that's the reason the insurance premiums are so high. But what's interesting is the lawyers in this country would tell you that the insurance premiums despite having lower awards and less awards, I would imagine, in the English courts, are just as high. So I think there needs to be, an informed discussion around this to see how we can alleviate landowners and occupiers' fears of their exposure to potential cases in the future.
Yes.
Because it's in everyone's interest to develop more amenities. It's in everybody's interest for that to happen, but not when it's going to be to the cost or to the detriment of an individual.
Exactly. And that would be incentive for landowners to designate a parts of their land that they're maybe not using for grazing or anything else. Like let's build a trail there, or let's build, something, and then everybody can benefit from that. Right?
Like coming back to the greenways, when you look at some of the ingenuity by the landowners along the established walkways and the businesses that they have been able to run off the back of the greenway, there's huge opportunity for everybody.
Yeah. Fantastic.
So if you had a bike trail, there could be a spin-off business by one of the landowners as well.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about climate change. It's like topic number one all over the place. So what's your, and maybe I'm just gonna, like, whatever we're talking about, is that position of the whole party, or is it like your position, or is it like any maneuver?
Today I'm talking in a personal capacity, but to be fair, the vast majority of what I believe is already adopted policy by my party, which is why I'm a member of the party I am.
Okay, so there is no...
So if I'm not sure about the party's position, something I'll say that, or if it's something that might be controversial, I'll preface it by saying my personal opinion.
Okay, all right, very good. So climate change, like what are the ways in what we should do to tackle that, and is that even possible to tackle?
Yeah, well, it's looking like we're not going to meet our targets, and we're going to be facing huge fines as a result of that. And in fairness, the financial consequences should not be our biggest concern. Our biggest concern should be, why aren't we meeting the targets, and what can we do to make sure that we leave this world in a better place than in which we received it.
Which is not looking like going to happen.
No, and you know what's really frustrating is when you look back at ancient Ireland, and if you look at, the ancient communities that existed, like particularly in Brehon times, they considered themselves the custodians of the land. And before it was ever, a fad or a buzzword or anything of that nature, those in Brehon society saw it their responsibility to guard and protect the environment in which they were, and they were custodians to pass it on, protected, to the next generation. And as I've travelled around the world, it's really interesting to see indigenous populations in the 21st century, and they still view things that way. The Native Americans, the Aboriginals, just to name two of the indigenous populations that I have had interactions with, and they do their utmost. But they're facing a losing battle because they're up against the rest of the Western developed world, who for too many generations were far more concerned about profit and what material wealth they could generate, rather than thinking ahead to, well, how will this impact on the world in which we live, and how will it impact on my grandchildren and their grandchildren and thereafter. So the penny has finally dropped, I think, with the majority of us in the Western world. But my concern is in this country, and I limit my comments to this country, that again, there is no real thought being put into the measures that need to be introduced to try and get us somewhere near making the targets that we need to. So, for instance, the government's and a number of other parties' suggestion that we should introduce a carbon tax is absolutely, in my view, ridiculous. Now, I know that there's an awful lot of people out there whose opinions on other matters I share that will be, pulling out their hair listening to me saying this. But the reason I say that is this: it will not do anything to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels in this country. Simply because people from the lower socioeconomic groupings do not have the option at the moment of having electric cars, never mind hybrids. So what you're going to be doing is punishing them for not being in a financial position to be able to upgrade their car to a newer car. Poor people who are reliant on turf and briquettes and coal and oil to fuel their houses do not have access to the money that would be required to upgrade their heating systems in their home. So they will continue to burn turf and coal, but they will be paying more for it. So what we need to see before...
they're not going to stop having heat, right?
No, well, that may well be happening. And then what you'll have
is unless you're gonna completely destroy them financially.
You'll have more people that will develop hypothermia, because we already have an issue in this country where we have an older population who are living in poverty, and they're living in food poverty and fuel poverty. And if we impose a carbon tax, they are going to be disproportionately affected. So they're going to be living in even greater fuel poverty than they already are, and food poverty as well, because they're going to have some element of heat. So what my party is proposing is that before you introduce a carbon tax, you introduce a load of measures that facilitate people to upgrade their heating systems, to actually have an option of owning an alternative type of vehicle. And then what you do is, when you have given people the option and the opportunity to have an alternative source, then you introduce your carbon tax, because then people have a choice. Whereas currently, the way it's proposed, it's not going to be giving people a choice. It's going to be punishing people who aren't in a financial position to be able to respond in the way they need to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. The other thing is our airline companies, who are making multi-billions every year, do not pay any VAT or tax on the fuel that they're using to fly their planes. And you have... and I'm going to use this
that
word.
seems to me not right.
No, and
like a flying industry, that's a very special thing, right? This is like how
and
they
that's
operate
why
is kind
we
of strange.
and we all benefit from it, and that's why I'm saying it won't be popular. We all benefit from the cheap deals. That's why some of us can afford to go to the sun, every second year or whatever it is.
By the way, the global warming, right?
But there are people who go away, they fly for weekends in a city abroad, or that go to New York shopping at Christmas. I would consider that frivolous and unnecessary flying. I would rather see those people spend their money in cities here in Ireland, or go and shop locally. So why not impose extra charges on the fuel consumption for those journeys, and therefore the person who's in a privileged position that they can afford to do it in the first place, they should be paying more. So there's a load of measures they could introduce before they get to the carbon tax.
This is very interesting, because just yesterday I had a similar conversation about the climate change. Is that what you're talking now locally about people who are the lower income people who are going to be impacted the most? The same mechanism is working globally, where the countries who are developing countries, third world countries, African countries, they're going to be hit the most.
Yes.
Because they can't afford. And, we saw these pictures of somewhere in the middle of Africa, where is a vaccination station, where they have a small refrigerator powered by solar panel, and it's like, well, that doesn't really work, and all those vaccines goes bad because that's all. And these countries will be most affected, not the countries who are actually producing the most emissions, because they, the West can cope with that. And this is fascinating that on a global and macro scale, the same exact mechanism applies on the local scale, the micro scale.
And on that global level, it is the developed, wealthier countries that had industries for generations that caused a lot of the damage that we're witnessing the results of now. And it is those developing countries that are now the most industrialized and up until this point hadn't contributed to the climate damage that has been done. And yet they're now going to suffer as a consequence of, industries.
You can't have oil now.
No,
you didn't have oil for all those generations. Now you can't have it as well. So, and do you think that this is really possible to tackle on a global and a local level? Because sometimes you listen to some people and you say well, it's absolutely, situation is so bad we can't do anything. And I hear voices saying like, well, nothing can be done anyway.
Well, one thing's for sure and certain, we can't do nothing. And if we do, I dread to think of the consequences. But I do think, like even locally, for instance, very simple measures that actually save county councils money. We spend, I would dread to think, how much every year on maintenance of green areas, be they grass verges along our roads, be they our town parks. And I have proposed to Kerry County Council, let's set wildflowers there. There's no maintenance, so you're not using machinery to cut it down every week for the entire growing season. You are also providing food for our dying bee populations and supporting biodiversity. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So that's one simple measure that every local authority around the country could take, and add to that, stop using Roundup. And look at what we could achieve for the environment by just that one simple measure.
That's great, because this is like a great pivot now to the subject of biodiversity.
Okay.
It was just
I'm reading your mind.
It was just
I'm
perfect.
telepathic.
Yes, you must be. It was just perfect, because that's another big subject, and something I'm quite passionate about. Not only biodiversity and making sure, you know, that our nature, we take care of it a little bit, because it's obviously not in a good shape. And also, as opposed, you know, it turns out controversial subject of rewilding and you know, introducing species of animals that were there and they're not there anymore, and so on and so forth. So can you lay it out for us? What are the proposals on that regard?
Yeah, well, that was one there, and that's probably the extent of what I have proposed so far in Kerry County Council. But I think we need to stop striving for perfection in the appearance of particularly our shared spaces. I think there is nothing more beautiful than nature in its natural form. And, you know, there's one person's, you know, tidy and neat is another person's just, no, that's not for me at all. Whereas, you know, there's so many habitats that have been disturbed. We do have declining populations in a number of different species. Even something as simple as our native trees and our native fruits and our native seeds.
Yes.
At one stage, I think we had in excess of 100 native Irish apple species. And I think that's down into single digits now. So there's the Seed Savers, are a fantastic organisation. They're trying to protect and distribute indigenous seeds to protect for future generations. I mean, going into a supermarket and buying a perfectly formed apple, that, and it comes back to what our discussion was earlier.
In a plastic wrapper.
In a plastic wrapper that was flown in from halfway across the world. I mean, that's illogical. And I know we all like to have what we like to eat all year round, but all crops should be seasonal, and you should eat seasonally and import as little as possible. Ireland used to be a self-sufficient island. It isn't anymore. And if you bring it right down to County Kerry, for instance, we had a huge tillage industry in Kerry. We had the finest malt barley. We had a sugar beet industry. All of that now is gone. And there is, and I know farmers can be very sensitive about criticism about the over-reliance on beef and dairy, but take the environmental issues out of it. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago, and the environmental issues are very, very important. But there are more reasons why our agricultural sector need to look more at, you know, going back to tillage farming and having a variety of different crops. And that's because the population of the world is increasing. And it's increasing dramatically. And I remember an article I read a couple of years ago, and it was saying that currently the richest nations in the world are those that have oil and gas reserves. And they were predicting that in 30 to 40 years' time, the richest nations in the world were going to be those that were involved in food production.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to look at this and diversify our farming a little bit as well, and stop striving for this perfection. You know, I remember what apples tasted like when I was younger. I mean, 30 years ago, an apple that I would have eaten taste completely different to what there's almost no flavor off of the apples we get now. We don't know what's being injected into them. We don't know the harm that it is doing to us
it's
internally.
like with the carrots, like when you go and buy the carrots of the farmer, like they're proper kind of kinked carrots and so they taste and they smell like carrots, and then you compare the stuff that you get in Tesco. This is like a red objects that
it's watery. A carrot should not be watery.
Exactly. So it's good. And you mentioned like a role of farmers in that, because it sometimes feel like people who are pro biodiversity and rewilding, they kind of like butting heads with farmers. They kind of in opposition. No, you don't have that feeling. No,
my experience of the majority of those in the farming community in Kerry they are the custodians of the land. They love the land, and they rely on nature to make a livelihood. So they don't deliberately or intentionally do anything. The majority of them, not all of them, to destroy what is providing them with their income. And a number of those that are involved in Kerry climate action, they are involved in food production themselves. And look, we have to be realistic about it. We are carnivores, okay? People, the vast majority of people are going to continue to eat meat. There is most certainly a need for a dairy and a beef industry, but we are going to regret, maybe in a decade or maybe in 2 decades' time, we are going to regret if we don't have producers of other types of food as well. And we need to go back to producing locally and purchasing local produce. And that's how we sustain it. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest corporations in the world, like Kerry Group, it started off as a cooperative, and that model was fabulous. Now it then became incorporated and it came about profit, and we've seen that they have become a global player, but the model they started off with could be introduced again, and it could be around a number of different varieties of food and not just the dairy that they started off with.
And do you think there are, or maybe not do you think, but this is a question about some schemes and programs to help get farmers involved in setting up designated areas of their land for wildlife, and just giving like completely, to your point about like some people are just cutting their lawn just nice and tidy and then spray the pesticides on it. There's nothing on it, but it looks nice to some. But then there are people who prefer to have like various species of grass and wildflowers and so on and so forth. So what's your position on incentivizing farmers to set out areas of land to wildlife, to native woodlands, to reintroducing species? We spoke on this podcast again many times on projects of reintroduce wolves or boar into Ireland and so on and so forth. Do you think it's realistic, and would it be beneficial?
Look, I suppose no different to my calling on the government to introduce schemes that would enable people to avail of alternative sources of heat and travel. So too would I support any calls to incentivise landowners to develop wild areas like what you're describing there. But I think we have to be practical about it as well. And what I would hate to see happen is what we have seen happen with all the other EU subsidy schemes that are there, that factory farms, a single individual who owns the vast majority of the land is disproportionately benefiting from it. They're getting the bulk of the grants that are coming into this country. I would much prefer to see incentives ring-fenced for those who are your traditional and average and small farmers. And if the bigger factory type farms are to do it, I would prefer to see them almost being compelled to do it, or if they are to be incentivized, not to benefit from the lion's share and leave the crumbs for the rest, like we've seen happen with the other EU schemes.
Yeah, and that's I suppose the worry that the scheme comes and goes, and then the farmer gets incentive to rewild a stream or a piece of land and do something, and he gets the money, and then that goes away, and then okay, now I'm done with this, and this comes back to as a pasture or something like that. So it has to be like a long-term planning.
Yeah.
And speaking about long-term planning, again, on the podcast, we spoke a few times about Sitka spruce. There's a big, again, one of the big conversations about Sitka spruce plantations and replacing that with the native woodlands. I think it was episode 29 of the podcast when we talked about this. What's your position on what Kilche is doing? And because obviously environmental groups are taking a big issue with the and not only environmental groups, I suppose, because it on one hand is like, oh, it's great, it's trees, it absorbs carbon, it helps us to meet our carbon targets. On the other hand, that's effectively a desert, nothing lives there. The trees are one close to another. There's no wildlife in it. There's a massive pollution going out of that because obviously that's also sprayed because effectively it's a timber.
It's a factory forest.
It's a factory forest. So, are there any chances? What's your position on replacing or moving towards replacing that with more native woodland kind of?
That's a position I always held until I was challenged on it recently, and I was asked to name what those native tree species were, and I started naming them, and I was told no, they weren't native to Ireland. They were introduced, and the individual was able to tell me around roughly the period that those types of trees were introduced to Ireland. So I'm still working on my counter argument, so I'm going to do my research and see if I can counter that individual.
So I'm thinking that you would like to agree with that, but you just don't feel like
you see, I had totally and completely up until this discussion on this campaign with an individual on it. Personally, I think aesthetically they look far better. These tree or forest factories, as I often refer to them, fine while they're growing, but then when they are cut down, it's like you've scarred the landscape in parts of the county when you go to.
It's called out something like that.
Yeah, and look, I need to, before I can give a well-informed answer on relation to the species themselves, but definitely I would prefer to see, and it comes back to what we're saying about, farming, and that there should be a healthy mix equally with our forests. There shouldn't be, a reliance on one species alone. I think everything, should be looked at, and having a blend of different types of species.
You're excellent. You're very well informed. So I try to go in a kind of specific thing that you might not know. But is there any view you have in particular on the rewilding, on the reintroduction of wild boar and introduction of wolves potentially further down the line? Obviously, farmers are and this is like a difference. Some farmers saying we're custodians of the lands, we would like to see wolves, but not necessarily next to our sheep.
Yeah.
And then there's a person no, absolutely no, we have bigger problems, don't even go there. And then we have ecological groups who say but the whole ecosystem will benefit from that so greatly, and so on. And to my surprise, I found this being quite a controversial subject, and even saying word rewilding, there's people coming out.
I'll be honest, I'm not informed enough to give a definitive position on it. I could see a lot of problems. And what I'm more concerned about is, it's now 2019, and it's an entirely different country in every way to what it was when they would have been roaming at the time. So we have a huge issue with deer in Killarney. And there's often people calling for culls on the deer. And while most would think, because they're such a beautiful species, they're majestic looking, and you might look and say, but sure, what harm could a couple of deer cause? But when you look at the rate at which they breed, when you look at the traffic accidents that have been caused,
30% a year.
Yeah. And then when you look at the whole issue that we have had in recent years with individuals who have been diagnosed with Lyme's disease that have been attributed to ticks that live on the deer, I would need to look into it a bit more before I could give a definitive position. And it's not that I'm dodging. I don't want to be fair. All things to all people, but before I make my mind up on something, I want to be informed.
It's fair. And Toiréasa, I many times on this podcast, again, I said, like, I am not so sure about introduction of wolves, and because it's like you say, it's a different country. And it's often that argument like, oh, well, it was like 8 million people in Ireland and wolves were there, right? And now it's less, it's 5 million and we don't have wolves. Why? But then the country is different. That 8 million people didn't have iPhones.
Yeah, but we occupied much less space, even though we were 8 million people. True. We occupied much less space, and look at the urban spread that we've had. And I mean, that even comes back to something I omitted to say when we were talking about climate change and our carbon footprint. Again, a carbon tax would disproportionately affect people living in rural Ireland because we don't have a proper or a functioning public transport system.
Yes.
So there isn't the option
I live in a rural area, and that was one of the things, like when my elderly mother came to me, is it like, what? You know, you're actually, if you're not driving a car, you're stuck.
Totally. We're totally reliant on it. So, yeah. So,
yeah. So you mentioned deer, and that's another perfect pivot into the deer, because there's one of the things in approach to wildlife management that I quite fond of, and it's based on American model, which I think America has like absolutely best in the world model of managing wildlife. That recreational hunters and anglers are making our source of funding for wildlife management, at least in the large part. So I have some sort of a discomfort knowing that, like you mentioned, there's a problem with deer, right? Too many deer in Killarney National Park, in Wicklow Mountains, in Phoenix Park in Dublin. And obviously there are people who straight away, if you even mention cull, they say like, oh, it's inhumane, it's this and that and something else, right? So that's one side of the equation. On the other side, what is happening, I'm not really comfortable with that either, because we're hiring people, paying them money, so they're going to do and call the deer. In my view, recreational hunters would gladly pay the money for the privilege to shoot that deer, have a venison, have a meat, provide a meat for their families, and at the same time kind of alleviate a problem with overpopulation with deer and so on. What's your view on that? Do you think like a hiring like a sharpshooters to call the deer and then is a better approach versus kind of trying to use, for want of a better word, recreational hunters, which would benefit and at the same time control the deer population?
I don't know, to be honest. Again, it's fraught with difficulties. The thought of, making money off of the back of people shooting animals for fun doesn't sit well with me. And I say that as someone whose husband is a member of a shooting club and has often been hunting. We have some great discussions in our household. But at the same time, I can see the logic to what's being proposed there, because there is, whether we like it or not, there is a desperate need to try and manage the deer population in Killarney National Park. I accept that fully. Something I have to look at again a bit more closely to see how I'd feel about that. It's my understanding that there are people paying nice big sums of money to do that, exactly what you've described, but I would imagine it's something that's been done unofficially. So if it was something that could go into the public purses rather than somebody's back pocket, and if it's happening anyway, I could see the logic to that.
Maybe I'm going to lay it out to you. What's my view on that is, we actually don't know how many deer we have in Ireland. There's no deer census, and there's no kind of like a central management of the population. There are a number of deer organizations,
Yes.
non-governmental organizations, which are not coordinating with each other, and I don't think they're advocating for any, move in any direction. And obviously, when you go to any hunter's course, the first thing they say, well, you need to know how many deer is there. You need to assess the population. You can plan a call, and you do this and that.
Yeah.
And looking at how it works in America, where it's a governmental agencies who know what is the population, what is the population dynamics, and they say like, well, from this area, this many deer can be taken. From this area, this many, and from this area, like, leave it, right? And then there's a tag system in place when you pay for a tag, and okay, let's say we have a surplus of 1,000 animals in the area, right? And the rate of success is 50%. So we can issue 2,000 tags to recreational hunters who pay for the money. They 50% rate of success, right? Then that money goes back to the management and to land improvement, to rewilding, to maybe some schemes for farmers and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great model, and I talk a lot about this obviously because I think that's a good solution. Because here's my concern, and especially with those deer organizations, is that hunters and anglers, they are usually, I'm not saying they're perfect, but they usually are people who care about the environment, and they care about the animal, and
I agree with you.
They care about ocean and so on and so forth. On the other hand, some ecological organizations, they're opposing each other. I even wrote a blog post about it called Sportsmen and Ecologists, that these are really people who should work together on protecting of the land and on protecting of the wildlife, not necessarily fight with each other about how we're going to use that, right? Because if we're not going to work together, we may lose it all completely. And then there's like nothing for nobody.
Okay.
So that's my point of view. And through that podcast also, I'm trying to spark the discussion between people who are maybe not so fond of hunting, but are fond of the environment, and with people who are maybe not so fond about ecological organizations and greenies or whatever, but they're fond of hunting. And my point is like, well, you guys better talk to each other, because this is one land, this is one landscape, right?
Okay.
So
yeah, there's something worth looking at.
So last thing before we wrap this up, I want to touch on fishing and protecting of the oceans and fishing rights, and how do you see this issue? Because obviously there's year and year discussion about fishing quotas that are too big or too small. Are French fishing Irish waters? Are not fishing Irish waters? Or what about local communities that's supposed to be? What's your take on that?
It goes right back to 1972 when the negotiations were going on for Ireland to join the EU. I mean, we literally sold the family silver. We handed over Irish fishing waters to the European Union and didn't even leave ourselves with the crumbs. And my father, before he went to jail, he was a fisherman. He came from a small farming background, and his main occupation was fishing. And I understand acutely how decimated the Irish fishing industry has been over successive decades since joining the European Union. It was basically what we gave in order to get some of the benefits that have been associated with being a member of the EU. So the greatest bugbear I have is that we have Irish fishermen who are being criminalised for fishing outside of their quota in Irish fishing waters, while at the same time they're looking on at French and Spanish trawlers and they're not even being boarded. And who knows if they are fishing inside or outside their very generous quotas. It's the Irish fishermen that are continuously being targeted and checked to see if they're filling up their logbook correctly. Are they catching what they are allowed to catch and within the quantities that they're allowed? That said, we do have some massive fishing vessels that are Irish owned as well, and it's no different to the farming situation here. We have those factory fishing boats who are basically taking the majority of the spoils, and there's very little left to be divided out amongst our fishermen. And there definitely has to be a rebalancing done, because there are very few people who would have been involved in the fishing industry with my father at the time when he was, that are still involved today. And I'm not aware of too many people under the age of 40 that are engaged in fishing, and that to me says it all. And aside from that, it is a very dangerous occupation to have.
Yes.
In my own community, I mean, when you go back to Fianna Pier, a couple of years ago, we set up a fisherman memorial committee to commemorate those who had been lost at sea. And during the period that we were planning to develop this monument to the people, we lost another person from our community. And when we were putting the plaques in place with the names of all of the individuals, we had to leave space, because we're resigned to the fact that in the future there will be others from our community who are going to be lost out of Phoenix Harbour as well. So it's a really dangerous profession. It's not a well-paying one for the smaller fishermen at all. Sometimes they might have a good haul and they might have a decent amount of money, but the next time they go out, it might cost them more, especially the skipper, if he's paying out a few lads in wages. It might cost him more in fuel and wages than what he actually gets for what they bring in.
Do you think it's because the state of the ocean is bad, and you know that the part of that is that because of our inshore waters are so, you know, here I say decimated in terms of number of fish and the quality of fish, then operating outside of the issues that you mentioned, but operating a small fishing boat is really not viable, and you need to have like this big, you know, super trawler that can, you know, kind of suck in whatever's left.
Well, it's those super trawlers that I believe are causing most of the issue when it comes to the catches that they get. But even, I think there's a myriad of reasons there. I mean, you have competing markets around the world. Like, say, for instance, most recently, the oyster fishermen, they actually cancelled a number of the days that they were going out because they weren't able to get the price for their oysters. You have issues around this country where there may be stuff going into the ocean that shouldn't be going in, treatment plants not working correctly and stuff like that, and that's causing issues. So you have a myriad of issues going on there, but at the end of the day, our governments, successive governments, have sold out our fishing communities. And what we need to be doing, say in Kerry County Council, for example, is identifying ways in which we can generate some economic activity in our coastal regions, so that those who were so dependent on fishing as their only source of income can diversify and have other options and other sources of income.
Would like a marine protected areas be the one?
Yeah, I mean, the development of this Blue Way to Phoenix is going to be a big plus. At one stage, I was asking the county manager to explore the possibility of developing either Phoenix or Dingle as potential stop-offs for cruise liners. It would obviously depend on the depths and the stuff like that. Perhaps even being a service port.
That wouldn't be good for the environment, would it?
Well, they're coming anyway, and they're passing by Ireland. So, you know, it's not that you're going to prevent the number of cruise liners that are in the ocean. What you're doing is you're just getting some kind of a benefit from it, and that they might
could also control them better with dropping their waste and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, you can impose all of that, but I'm sure the other destinations where they go to try and do that too. But even being a service port for some of those companies that are exploring off of the Irish coast, I mean, they're exploring anyway and looking for gas and oil reserves. So why not have food producers in Kerry supplying them with what they need? Why not use Fianna Port to ship that in and out to wherever they're drilling?
Would you be supportive of those companies who are looking for gas and drilling and so on, or it's not something that you like?
My own party position, as well as my own personal, is that where you have natural resources like that, it is the state in an ideal situation, that would be exploring and ensuring that any fines that are made would be used for the benefit of the people of the state and not for the benefit of increasing already bursting at the seams bank accounts for multi-global corporations. But the reality of where we are now is the governments that we haven't been interested in that, and they have sold off rights to these companies. So they're going to be drilling there anyway, regardless of...
I'm coming more from the perspective of protecting of the environment, and like that can't be good for the marine resources.
You know, there's arguments for and against, not even for and against, there are arguments that say how destructive the exploration of gas and oil is to the environment, and then there are arguments that those companies put forward, and I'm sure they're well paid for positions where they show all the researches and about all the protections they put in place to minimise the impact, if at all, and all of that. And I'm not really going to get into the detail of that, but whether we like it or not, no matter how ambitious our plans are to bring down our carbon footprint, to develop renewable energies, the fact remains that at least for the next 30 years, if not longer, we are going to need gas and oil in order to develop these renewable energies and to, I suppose, complement them between now and then. So exploration is going on. So I'm just being practical about it. Feenit is the closest port to the Porcupine Basin, as far as I know. It's much closer than Foynes. They're currently one of the companies is using Foynes as a service port. And I'm talking about a service port only, where you're shipping out supplies to those who are out drilling. And why not? Why not use Feenit to be the service port? Why not let Kerry County Council get the benefit of harbour dues? Why not get the local businesses benefit from the trade that would develop as a result of this? And, you know, if there is a find, I'm not advocating that we should be the port that they should ship the oil or the gas into. I'm just saying that we should definitely be pitching Feenit as a potential service port. Because whether we like it or not, the government have given these companies the licenses to explore.
Last question. What do you think, what's the role of NGOs, of non-governmental organizations, in driving the policies of protecting the environment and biodiversity and climate change? Do you think they're playing an important role, or would you like to see them more coming forward and engaging with the governments and local communities? Or
I suppose their role is as important as anybody's. It's going to be a collective effort that's going to achieve the positive changes that we need. And without going into any specific organisation, I mean, any contribution that they make at all is going to be welcomed. But unless you have the political will there, the change that's needed is not going to happen. And the only way to ensure that there is a political impetus to do this is if the people start demanding it. And that's why I was so heartened to see the young people organising and agitating, because that's what you need. I mean, that's what Connolly said way back in the day. You need to organise, educate and agitate. And when it comes to protecting our environment, I think we need to do the same. And, you know, we can all individually do something small that will contribute hugely as a collective. So, for instance, for this local election, we made the decision in our office that we weren't going to order thousands of corryboard signs that take 400 years to break down. We know we have, rather unpredictable weather here in Kerry, but we said, look, to heck with it. We ordered paper posters that we put onto wood. Now, a storm came 2 days later and most of them were destroyed. So we ordered more paper that we could staple on top of it. And that's the way we're getting through it. So that was very small effort that we made that has saved thousands of posters of corryboard sitting there in somebody's shed for the next 400 years before they eventually break down or going into landfill eventually. So there's small little measures we can each make. In Kerry County Council, I've asked the county manager repeatedly to engage with local businesses to explore ways that we could incentivise or encourage them to reduce their reliance on plastic. In Kerry County Council, we have banned more or less the use of single-use plastics. We no longer have, paper and plastic cups for the water dispenser or for the teas and coffees. It's all mugs or those hard plastic cups that are reusable.
Like in Kerry County Council.
In Kerry County Council.
Is any plastic come like at the wider world with that ban?
Well, we have made the statement that we're not going to use single-use plastics. So if they are being used in the organisation, it must be something that was purchased prior to this statement of intent. And going forward, we won't be. But when you consider the hundreds of staff that work, I think it's nearly 1,000 staff. Yeah. So if every single day one of them were using at least one plastic cup.
Would you support a national policy to ban?
Definitely for single-use plastics. Yeah, absolutely. There's no need. There's absolutely no need. I know I try to be practical on most things, but there's no need to go in and buy 4 apples that are in a styrofoam curved out base, wrapped in plastic, that you go up to the till and then they put it into another plastic bag.
Or like potatoes, they're potatoes and they're in a plastic bucket, and that bucket is wrapped again
in plastic. What? It's illogical and unnecessary.
Potatoes.
Yeah.
Why you do this?
And I actually prefer to buy all of my produce loose because you can look at it and feel it and see what's fresh and what's not. But whereas they're in their pre-packaged containers, which is probably part of why they do it, you just have to take what you get. And if there's one rotten piece in amongst them, then you're taking that as well.
Then you have to dispose the container. Listen, it's been great conversation. Is there anything that we haven't covered and that you would wish we covered? So is there anything that you would like to leave us with a concluding
nothing
thoughts?
That you haven't asked me about, Tommy. An awful lot of it I wasn't expecting and I wasn't prepared. So if anybody there is giving out stink about an answer I gave, I was caught on the hop. So I just went with the instinct.
Very good. It was great. Toiréasa, thank you very much for doing this.
No problem, Tommy. Thank you.